snow fell soft and silent over Blackthorn territory, the night Astrid Kine learned the truth about her own marriage. She stood outside the war room just past the heavy oak doors, holding a cup of spiced wine she had warmed with her own hands because the kitchen staff had already gone to bed. Old habit. 9 years of being mated to an alpha teaches a woman how he likes his wine heated slow, never boiled. A single clove dropped in at the end so the bitterness never came through. She still remembered. She wished she didn't. Inside, Ronan Draven's voice was low and even the tone he used when he was commanding, not conversing. She knew that voice. She had heard it in council chambers, at border disputes, once at her own father's funeral pyre when he had pulled her aside to discuss territory lines before the ashes had even cooled. Ronan managed things. That was what an alpha did. That was what he was. "She means nothing," he said. "She never did." Astrid's hand stopped moving. The cup was warm against her palm, and the corridor smelled of pine smoke and old stone and the particular cold that came before deep winter. "The mating was strategic," Ronan went on. "You know that, Kestrel. It secured the southern border. It kept the Kine bloodline loyal to Blackthorn instead of rising against us. That is all it was ever meant to be." Astrid waited for something inside her to break. She expected a collapse, a wound tearing open, the kind of grief the old songs described, a mate's heart failing when the bond is spoken against. Instead, what she felt was a terrible, clarifying stillness, the same stillness she felt in her body when she set a broken bone and needed her hands not to shake. "She never did." 4 words, clean as a blade drawn slow. She set the cup down on the stone ledge beside the door without a sound, gathered her fur cloak from where she had draped it minutes before, and walked toward the far stairs. She did not run. Running would have meant something had truly broken, and Astrid Kine did not intend to give Ronan Draven the satisfaction of her breaking, not even where he couldn't see it. She did not weep on the stairs. She did not weep crossing the frozen courtyard, or in the healer's cottage she had shared with him for 9 winters, or during the long walk to the nursery wing where she stood outside a small door and watched lamplight flicker beneath it. She had learned long ago, in the worst hours of the infirmary, that grief handled too quickly rarely healed clean. It was better to hold still, breathe, and let the first shock pass before deciding what to do with it. The same discipline she used on a patient's family before delivering news no one wanted to hear. Briar was 8. She left her lamp burning when she was frightened of the wind howling through the pines, which meant she was probably still awake, probably tracing the shapes of wolves on the ceiling with her finger the way she always did before sleep finally took her. Astrid knew this the way she knew everything about her daughter, carefully, completely, the way a woman learns a thing she is terrified of losing. She opened the door. Briar was curled beneath her blankets, dark-haired like her father, stubborn-jawed like her mother, and possessed of something entirely her own, an old soul in a small body, the pack elders always said. Astrid crossed the room, blew out the lamp, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Mama," Briar mumbled, half asleep. "Go back to sleep, little wolf," Astrid whispered. "I'm here." She sat beside the bed a long while after Briar's breathing evened out, and in the dark she asked herself the question that would follow her for months to come. What now? She was 31 years old. She was the Blackthorn Pack's healer, trained in the old ways and the human ways both, the only person in 3 territories who could set a wolf's spine after a bad fall or draw silver poison from a wound before it turned the blood black. She had built the infirmary herself, plank by plank, the year after she arrived. She had believed foolishly that a life built with your own 2 hands could not be taken from you. She had been wrong. She thought about waking her sister. Freya would come running within the hour, half-shifted before she even reached the door, ready to put her claws through Ronan Draven's throat on principle alone. But it was deep in the night, and Freya had 2 pups of her own to mind, and some part of Astrid was not ready for anyone else's rage to make this real. So she sat in the dark of her daughter's room and tried to find the exact moment the bond between her and Ronan had gone hollow. There wasn't one. Not a single fight, not a single night she could point to and say, there, that is where it cracked. Just a slow erosion, a decade of small absences, a mate who was always almost present, always half a step turned toward his throne instead of toward her. Outside, the wind moved through the black pines the way it always did in deep winter, indifferent to what had just ended inside the walls it circled. She thought unwillingly of the first winter she had come to Blackthorn, 22 years old, newly bonded, standing in the same courtyard while Ronan taught her to read the shift of clouds before a storm rolled down from the ridge. He had been different then, or she had believed he was. He had laughed easily. He had pulled her into the snow once, both of them soaked and breathless, and told her that whatever else happened to him, whatever the throne demanded of him, he would never let it make him someone who forgot how to laugh in the snow with his mate. She wondered now whether that man had ever truly existed, or whether she had simply wanted him to badly enough to invent him from very little. She did not let herself finish that thought. There was no use in it. A healer did not spend her strength grieving a wound that had already closed over wrong. She cut it open again and set it properly, however much that hurt in the moment. Near dawn, she rose from the chair beside Briar's bed and walked back down to the healer's cottage to begin packing what mattered. Kestrel found her there an hour later, standing in the doorway with the stiff, uncomfortable posture of a beta who had clearly been sent to check on her and clearly did not want the errand. "He doesn't know I heard him," Astrid said, before Kestrel could find whatever careful words he'd rehearsed on the walk over. "I want that understood. I'm not leaving because I'm ashamed of a confrontation I never had. I'm leaving because I already have every answer I need." "Astrid." "Don't," she said gently, because none of this was Kestrel's doing. "You don't have to defend him to me. You don't have to apologize for him either. Just tell me the council won't make this harder than it needs to be for Briar's sake, and I'll be gone within the week." Kestrel was quiet a moment, his jaw working. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I never believed it was only strategy. 9 years, Astrid. I watched him with you. Whatever he told himself tonight in this room, alone with his pride, I don't think that was ever the whole truth of it." "Maybe not," Astrid said. "But he said it aloud in front of you, believing I couldn't hear. That tells me which truth he actually chose to live by." Kestrel had no answer for that. He left without another word, and Astrid understood, watching him go, that even the wolves loyal to Ronan Draven suspected he had just done something to himself that could not easily be undone. By the time the moon set, Astrid had made her decision. She would not scream. She would not beg him to take the words back. She would simply leave, and she would take her daughter, and she would build something true out of whatever was left to her. She did not yet know that leaving would be the smallest part of what came next, that somewhere beneath Ronan Draven's chest, in the place where a bonded wolf lives beside its alpha's heart, something ancient and furious had just woken up. The Blackthorn Council did not stop her. That surprised her more than the leaving itself. Ronan's beta, a broad, quiet wolf named Kestrel Ash, met her at the gates 2 mornings later with a look she couldn't read, something between shame and relief. "The Alpha says you may take the healer's cottage possessions and half the silver reserve," he said, formal as a proclamation, avoiding her eyes. "Briar remains blood of Blackthorn. She'll winter with her father twice a year, once at the spring moon, once at the harvest." "I know the custom," Astrid said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced that in the mirror the night before, the way she practiced setting her face before delivering bad news to a grieving family. "Tell your Alpha I don't need his permission for what's already mine." Kestrel's jaw worked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. She left with a wagon of medicines, 2 trunks, her daughter, and a settlement that was fair only because Ronan's council knew she could name every border skirmish she had stitched shut with her own hands, every debt of loyalty the Kine bloodline was owed. His advisors were not fools, whatever else they were. The territory she chose was Asheville, neutral ground, a small pack with no alpha strong enough to matter to anyone, which was precisely why she chose it. Nobody in Asheville cared what had happened at Blackthorn. Nobody looked at her like a cautionary tale. The cottage she found sat at the edge of the tree line, small and drafty, with a hearth that smoked when the wind came from the north, and a view of a bakery 2 streets over that began smelling of fresh bread before dawn, which Briar declared within the first week, the greatest thing that had ever happened to anyone in the history of the world. The Asheville elders were wary of her at first, a Blackthorn healer, cast off or fled. No one was quite certain which, arriving with a trunk of medicines and a child on her hip, and no pack mark to vouch for her. The eldest among them, a weathered she-wolf named Odessa who had buried 2 mates and outlived 3 alphas, studied Astrid for a long moment on that first cold morning and finally said, "Blackthorn's lost then. We'll see what you're made of before we decide whether it's ours to keep." It was not a warm welcome. It was, Astrid would later understand, exactly the kind of welcome she needed, one that asked nothing of her sympathy and demanded everything of her competence instead. She earned her place within the month, when a trapper's son was brought to her half-frozen and bleeding from a fall on the ice, his leg bent wrong beneath him, his father weeping openly at the edge of the small room because every healer in 3 villages had already refused the case as hopeless. Astrid worked through the night by candlelight, setting the bone, drawing infection from a wound that had already begun to blacken, holding the boy's hand and talking him through the pain in a low, steady voice that never once wavered even when her own hands were shaking with exhaustion by dawn. The boy walked again by midsummer. Word of it moved through Asheville faster than any introduction could have. After that, no one asked why the Blackthorn healer had come to their territory. They only asked when she could see the next patient. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did at the edge of wolf country. Astrid rebuilt her infirmary from nothing, traded medicine for lumber, traded stitches for stone, worked until her hands ached and her mind had no room left in it for Ronan Draven's voice saying she never did. She told her sister she was fine. She told the Asheville elders she was fine. She told herself the same thing on the long walks home after tending a difficult birth or a bad wound, when the moon was high and the forest was quiet, and there was nothing left to distract her from the shape of what her life had become. There were nights in that first year when the fine cracked just slightly at the edges, usually late, usually when Briar was asleep and the cottage was quiet enough that Astrid could no longer outrun her own thoughts with work. She would sit by the banked fire and think of the woman she had been at 22, laughing in the snow, certain that permanence was a thing you could simply choose and then keep. She did not regret leaving. She never once regretted leaving. But she allowed herself, on those quiet nights, to grieve the version of her life she had believed in for 9 years, because a healer knew better than most that grief unacknowledged did not disappear. It only waited patiently for a weaker moment to demand its due. By the time true autumn arrived, she had stopped counting those nights as failures. They were simply part of the healing, the way a wound needed to ache before it properly closed. She was fine, she told herself, right up until the morning in early autumn when the healer she usually traded herbs with had closed his stall for the season, and she wandered 2 streets further than usual, and walked directly into the chest of a man she had not laid eyes on in 11 years. He caught her basket before it hit the ground. His hands moved with a speed and a stillness that had nothing ordinary in them, the reflexes of a wolf far older and far more disciplined than his face let on. "Astrid," he said. She knew that voice before she even looked up. Low, deliberate, a voice that measured its words the way a blade measures its edge before it's ever drawn. "Verk," she said, not a question. Verk Ashwood looked like 11 years had done to him what 11 years did to wolves who carried old power and older discipline in equal measure. He was broader now, his dark hair longer, a silver scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before. He watched her with an expression she still could not fully read, which had always, infuriatingly, been true of him. "I didn't know you were in Asheville," he said. I've been here 9 months. She straightened, gathering herself, gathering the basket he handed back to her. You. Passing through. A pause, something crossing behind his eyes too fast to name. I heard about Blackthorn. Of course he had. Everyone in Wolf Country had heard about Blackthorn by now. How could they not, with what was beginning to happen there? But Astrid was not ready to speak of that, not with him, not on a market street with her arms full of herbs and her heart doing something complicated she had not authorized. I have patience waiting, she said, which was true. It was good to see you, Verk. She walked away before he could answer. She felt his eyes on her back the entire length of the street, and she did not look behind her, and she told herself very firmly that this changed nothing at all. She was, of course, wrong about that too. She had met Verk Ashwood 14 years before Ronan, back when she was a young healer's apprentice with dirt under her nails, and not yet enough confidence to argue with the pack elders about treatment methods. He had come through Asheville then too, a lone wolf with no pack mark on his shoulder and no explanation for why, and he had looked at her the way no one had looked at her before or since, like he was trying to memorize the exact shape of her laugh before it disappeared. She still remembered the night he'd first told her his name, sitting on a fallen log above this very river, both of them younger and unguarded in a way neither of them would ever quite manage again. Verk, he'd said, like the word cost him something. Just Verk. No pack behind it. She had asked him why a lone wolf would choose to linger so long in one small territory, and he had looked at her with an intensity that made her stomach drop and said, I hadn't planned to. Then I met you, and every reason I had to keep moving stopped feeling like a good enough reason. She had loved him with the reckless, total honesty of a girl who had never been burned yet. And he had loved her back. She was certain of that even now, certain in the marrow-deep way you're certain of very few things in life. But there had been rooms in Verk's life he would not let her enter, and questions he answered honestly only up to a point. And then a night when he had sat her down and told her the truth so plainly it had ended everything. I am hunted, he had said, not by men, by my own blood. If you stay near me, that danger becomes yours, and I will not do that to you. Leave, Astrid, leave before you cannot. He hadn't lied. He hadn't pretended to be something softer than he was. He had told her exactly what he carried and exactly why she should run from it. And in some small, furious corner of her heart, she had hated him a little for making the choice so clean. She had left. She had met Ronan Draven 6 months later, an alpha with land and lineage, and a bond mark that had settled onto her skin the very first night they touched, the old magic recognizing something in her that even she hadn't chosen. She had told herself that was better than choosing. Safer. A life the moon itself had picked for her, rather than one she'd have to defend to anyone. She understood now, 11 years and one broken bond later, how wrong that reasoning had been. She did not seek Verk out again after the market street. She told herself she was not going to think about him, and she thought about him for 4 days straight, his face surfacing between patients, between the long, silent hours stitching wounds, in the space of a breath before sleep finally took her. He found her on the 5th day. Not dramatically. He simply appeared at the edge of the infirmary clearing one evening as she was banking the fire, waiting at a respectful distance the way a wolf waits when he does not want to be mistaken for a threat. You didn't come looking, he said. You told me not to once. I listened. I'm good at listening when it matters. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile. I'd like to see you again, if you're willing. She studied him across the dying firelight. 11 years, a silver scar, a stillness in him that hadn't been there before, as though he'd spent a long time learning to hold something down. Part of her wanted to turn him away on principle alone. She had built, brick by careful brick, a life that finally belonged only to her and Briar, and some cautious, self-protective corner of her mind whispered that letting Verk Ashwood back into it was an act of reckless carelessness she could not afford twice. She had trusted a man's stillness before and mistaken it for depth, only to discover it had been distance all along. What made this different? What made her certain this wasn't simply the same mistake wearing an old, familiar, achingly handsome face? Nothing makes it certain, she admitted to herself. That's what makes it frightening. But there was another part of her, quieter and more stubborn, that remembered a boy on a riverbank 14 years ago who had told her the truth even when the truth cost him everything. And she found she could not, in good conscience, punish this version of him for a caution that had once been an act of protecting her rather than deceiving her. "One conversation," she said. "Not near the infirmary. I don't need Asheville gossiping about the disgraced healer from Blackthorn taking up with a lone wolf." "Fair," he said, and something in his voice sounded almost like relief. They met 3 days later at a quiet clearing above the river, where the sound of moving water made silence feel less like an ending and more like a beginning. He arrived exactly when he said he would. She noticed that. She noticed a great many things about him that she had spent 11 years pretending she'd forgotten. "You have a daughter," he said, not a question. He'd clearly asked around, which she'd expected and refused to let mean anything. "Briar, she's 8. The mating ended 8 months ago." She wrapped her hands around a cup of tea she'd brought, more for something to hold than for warmth. "You." "No mate, no pups. Simple, no elaboration." She waited. "I've been in the Northern Territories 5 years," he said. "Came back to Asheville country this spring." "Why?" He looked at her steadily, the firelight the last of the daylight through the pines, catching the scar along his jaw. "Business I'm not going to explain to you tonight. The part of your life I was never allowed into," she said. "We're not doing that again, Verk, whatever this is. I won't stand outside another closed door and call it love." He was quiet a long moment. "I know, I'm not asking you to." A pause, and something in him seemed to crack open just slightly, the careful containment slipping. "I saw you in that market and He stopped, started again. "I have thought of you for 11 years. I'm aware that isn't something I'm owed the right to say." "It's honest," she said. "You always preferred honest even when it cost you." "I still do." She didn't agree to see him again that evening, not in words. But she didn't tell him not to come back either, and when she walked home under a sky just beginning to show stars, her chest was doing something complicated and unfamiliar that felt, terrifyingly, like hope. She told Freya that night, sitting on her sister's floor while Freya's pups slept in the next room. "I liked him," Freya said immediately, not even pretending to be surprised. "You know, I always liked him. You left him because you were frightened, and then you mated an alpha who looked safe, and he turned out safe and cold and cruel all at once. That's reductive." "Is it wrong?" Astrid didn't answer. That was itself an answer, and Freya knew her well enough not to push further. "See him again," Freya said instead, softer now. "Or don't, but stop pretending you don't know what you want just because wanting it terrifies you." What Astrid wanted was not a thing she was prepared to examine on a quiet evening with her sister's fire crackling and her nieces and nephew asleep down the hall. What she wanted was something she had folded away 11 years ago, the careful way you fold away things that don't fit the life you've decided to build. She sent word to Verk the following week. "Briar has a gathering with the Asheville pups Friday evening. I'm free after moonrise if you'd like to share a meal." He answered within the hour, "Yes, where?" She chose a place she actually liked, a small hearth house at the edge of the market square that had been serving venison stew and dark bread for 30 years, warm and unpretentious, nothing like the grand halls of Blackthorn. She arrived early, as she always did. He arrived exactly on time, as he always had. Over the meal, he talked, and that was different from before. The old Verk had been watchful, contained, a wolf who asked questions and revealed himself only in small, careful doses. This version of him had gaps in the containment, moments where something honest slipped free before the careful part of him could stop it. He spoke of the Northern Territories, of work she understood in pieces and other work that lived in a gray place she was still deciding how to feel about. He spoke of his mother, gone 3 winters now, and something in his face went unguarded and soft in a way that made her throat tighten. He spoke of what it had felt like to return south and find the world both unchanged and entirely different, himself included, he said, and didn't finish the thought. She told him about the infirmary, about a wounded pup she'd stayed up 3 nights running to save, about Briar, who had recently announced her intention to become a healer like her mother, only better, and had begun following Astrid around demanding to learn the names of every herb in the cottage. "You're a good mother," Verk said. "I'm a tired mother. You're a good healer." "I'm getting better at the mother part." She looked into her cup. "You're too generous with your praise." "Maybe," his mouth curved just barely, "you're too hard on yourself." "Also maybe." They stayed until the hearth house had mostly emptied, until the owner passed by twice with the particular polite look that meant closing time. He helped her fasten her cloak without being asked, an old habit she'd forgotten he had, and the memory of it struck her somewhere behind the ribs. "Outside, under a sky gone fully dark," he said, "I'd like to see you again." "I know, is that a yes?" She studied him in the moonlight, which had not gotten easier to look at over 11 years. "It's a maybe," she said. "I have Briar to think of. I have a life that finally works. I'm not going to blow it apart," he offered. "I was going to say disrupt it carelessly. That's kinder." "I'm trying to be less careless." "How's that going?" "Poorly," he admitted, so plainly that she laughed, a real laugh, one that surprised her with how easily it came, because she hadn't laughed without effort in longer than she wanted to admit. She walked home alone through the quiet streets, thinking about tired and careless, and the way Verk Ashwood had looked at her across that table like she was the only thing in the room worth his attention, and whether that was something she was still allowed to want. There was a night, early in that season, when Astrid nearly ended things before they'd properly begun. She had come home from a difficult birth, exhausted past the point of good judgment, and found Verk waiting on her doorstep with a small basket of bread from the bakery 2 streets over, and something about the simple domestic sweetness of the gesture had frightened her more than any danger could have. "I can't do this if it's going to end the way it ended before," she said, before he'd even set the basket down. "I can't build something with you only to have you decide, one day, that protecting me means disappearing again without a word. I need to know now, before I let myself want this any further, that you're not going to vanish the moment things get complicated." Verk set the basket down slowly and looked at her with a seriousness that cut through her exhaustion. "I left once because I believed staying would get you killed," he said. "I have spent 11 years regretting that I never gave you the choice to decide that risk for yourself. I won't make that mistake twice. Whatever comes for me, and something will come for me eventually, Astrid, I won't pretend otherwise. I intend to face it standing next to you, not by vanishing to spare you the sight of it. If that's not enough of a promise, tell me now, and I'll walk away tonight and never trouble your door again." "I don't want you to walk away," she said, quieter now, some of the fear draining out of her voice. "I want you to understand why I'm frightened of wanting this." "I do understand," he said. "I've been frightened of it for 11 years. She let him in that night, and they sat at her small table eating bread that had gone slightly cold, saying very little, and it was, she would later think, one of the most honest evenings of her life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because for the first time since Blackthorn she had said her fear aloud instead of swallowing it, and he had met it plainly instead of managing it away. Autumn deepened into the first frosts. She saw him not constantly, not with any urgency, because she had no bandwidth left for urgency, and he seemed to understand that without being told. He met Briar on a quiet afternoon by the river, and Briar studied him with her serious 8-year-old assessment face and asked him 4 increasingly specific questions about wound herbs, testing him openly, and he answered honestly that he knew very little about herbs but was willing to learn. Briar told her mother later that he seemed acceptable. From an 8-year-old who had watched her parents' bond fail up close, that was the highest praise available. One evening in late October, Verk arrived at the cottage with a small carved wooden otter, rough-edged and clearly whittled by an unpracticed hand, and presented it to Briar with the same solemn formality he might have used addressing a council of elders. "It's terrible," Briar informed him, turning it over with the brutal honesty of childhood. "I know," Verk said. "I've never carved anything before. I thought you should have the first attempt, bad as it is, rather than wait for me to get good enough that it stopped being embarrassing." Briar considered this with great seriousness, then set the otter on the shelf beside her bed where it stayed. "You can practice," she informed him. "I'll tell you which ones are less terrible than the last one." Astrid, watching from the doorway, felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was still braced tight. It was such a small thing. An ugly little wooden otter, a child's blunt verdict, a grown man accepting the correction without wounded pride, and yet it told her more about who Verk Ashwood had become than any of his careful words at the river clearing ever had. Ronan had never once in 9 years sat on the floor of a child's room and asked to be told honestly how he could do better. He had not been built for correction. Verk, it seemed, welcomed it. She did not say any of this aloud. She only made tea and let the evening stretch on longer than she'd planned, and did not examine too closely why she minded so little. What Astrid had not let herself fully admit was that she was happier. Not the lightning strike kind she'd read of in old songs and never quite trusted. Something smaller and steadier. She laughed more easily. She stopped measuring the size of her cottage against the halls of Blackthorn and started noticing what her cottage actually was: warm, and hers, and smelling of Briar's hair, and some mornings of fresh bread carried on the wind. And then, deep into the second month of true winter, word reached Asheville of something happening at Blackthorn that made the whole pack go quiet around their fires. Something that would change everything Astrid thought she understood about the man she had left behind. The first rumor came from a trader, passing through Asheville's market with wares and gossip in equal measure. "They say the Blackthorn Alpha can't shift," the trader told anyone who'd listen, delighted with how much attention the words bought him. Not won't. Can't. Stood before his own council at the winter moon and called the change, and nothing answered. His wolf's gone silent inside him. Astrid heard it secondhand, from Freya, who came to the infirmary breathless with the news and something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. "His wolf refused him," Freya said. "You know what that means. A wolf doesn't refuse its alpha unless something's broken between them that isn't supposed to break." Astrid kept her hand steady, grinding root into paste, refusing to let her sister see how the words landed. "I don't know anything about it." "You know exactly what it means, Astrid. You're a healer. A wolf and its alpha aren't two separate things, they're bound. And a bonded mate feeds an alpha's strength. Everyone knows that old law, even if half the packs pretend they've forgotten it. If the bond between an alpha and his true mate is broken by his own hand, by his own words." "Freya." Her sister stopped, but the look on her face didn't change. "I'm only saying what the elders are already saying. His power is fatting, Astrid. Every alpha in 3 territories has heard it by now. Ironclaw's alpha stopped sending tribute. Riverbend hasn't answered his last 3 summons. They're circling him like the weakness is a scent they can follow." Astrid set down the pestle. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always did, indifferent to kings rising or falling. She told herself it wasn't her concern. She told herself Ronan Draven had built his own downfall the night he stood outside a war room and called 9 years of her life nothing. She told herself, over and over through the following weeks, that whatever was happening to his wolf was not a wound she owed him comfort for. But she was a healer. She had spent her whole life understanding the body's language, wolf and human both, and some deep, trained instinct in her recognized the shape of what Freya was describing even before the elders confirmed it at the next gathering. The old law was real. Every healer learned it in their first year of training, tucked into the oldest texts. half forgotten because no alpha in living memory had been foolish enough to test it. And alpha's strength is not his alone. It is drawn, in part, from the truth of his bond. Speak falsehood against your true mate, deny what the moon has joined, and the wolf inside you will know before your tongue has finished the lie. It will not answer a master who has broken faith with what makes him whole. Ronan had called their bond strategic. He had said she meant nothing. And his wolf, the ancient, instinctive half of him that could not be commanded, only earned, had apparently decided to believe him. She sought out Odessa the following afternoon, ostensibly to restock certain roots the old woman kept in her garden, and asked, as carefully neutral as she could manage, what the eldest of Asheville knew of an alpha whose wolf refused to answer him. Odessa did not look up from the herbs she was sorting. You already know the old law, girl. You wouldn't be asking if you didn't. I want to hear it from someone who's seen it happen, not just read it in a text. I've seen it once, Odessa said, long before you were born, an alpha in the Eastern Territories who cast off his mate for a richer alliance and told his council the bond had been a mistake from the start. His wolf went silent within the season. Some healers said it would never return, that a wolf, once it stops trusting the man wearing its skin, doesn't easily start trusting him again. She set down her shears and finally looked at Astrid directly. He spent the rest of his life half a man. Strong enough to survive, never strong enough to truly rule again. The pack tolerated him out of habit more than respect, right up until a rival finally took what he could no longer properly hold. Is there no way to restore it? The old texts say faith broken can be answered, if it's answered honestly and answered in the open, before the same eyes that witnessed the breaking. Odessa's gaze did not waver. But I'll tell you what the texts leave out, because I've lived long enough to know it firsthand. An apology given only to save a throne isn't honest, whatever words it's dressed in. Wolves know the difference between a man who regrets what he lost and a man who only regrets losing it publicly. So do their own wolves, buried down in that old, instinctive place words can't easily fool. She went back to her sorting. Why do you ask, girl? Surely you've no reason left to hope that particular alpha finds his strength again. I don't, Astrid said. I only wanted to understand what's happening to him. Understanding isn't the same as hopping. Odessa made a small, knowing sound in her throat and said nothing further. And Astrid walked home, turning the old woman's words over and over, unable to shake the uncomfortable feeling that they mattered more than she wanted them to. She thought of Ronan differently that night than she had in months, not with longing, something colder and stranger, a kind of grim, unwilling recognition. He had spent 9 years building his strength on a foundation he did not respect. And now the foundation had simply stopped holding him up. She raised the question with Freya one evening, half ashamed of even asking it aloud. Is it wrong, she said, that some small part of me doesn't want him to suffer for this? I know what he did. I know exactly what he said and exactly how it felt to hear it. And still, I sat with the elders' stories about wolves who never recover their strength, who spend the rest of their lives half of what they were, and I felt something that wasn't triumph. I didn't like what I felt. It's not wrong, Freya said, more gently than Astrid expected. You spent 9 years loving him before you spent one night hatting him. That doesn't disappear because the ending was ugly. It just means you're not cruel, Astrid, whatever he was to you. There's a difference between wanting justice and wanting ruin. You're allowed to want the first without feeling guilty for not wanting the second. And if wanting the first means walking back into that hold. Freya was quiet a long moment. Then you walk back in as a healer, not as his mate. You've built enough of a life now that you get to choose exactly which parts of your old one you're willing to touch again and on what terms. Nobody gets to demand more of you than that. Not him, not the old law, not even your own conscience. Astrid turned the words over for days afterward, and though they didn't erase the discomfort entirely, they gave it a shape she could finally work with, the shape of a decision she was making deliberately, rather than a debt she was being pulled toward against her will. She did not go to him. She told herself firmly that she would not, that whatever was happening at Blackthorn was a consequence he had earned with his own mouth, and consequences were not hers to soften. But 3 weeks later, a Blackthorn courier arrived at her infirmary door at dusk, travel-worn and grim-faced, carrying a folded letter sealed with the Draven crest, a crest she had once worn stitched into her own cloaks, back when she'd believed it meant something permanent. She stood in her doorway a long moment before breaking the seal, Briar's voice drifting from the next room where she was practicing herb names with Verk, who had taken to visiting most evenings now, patient and steady in a way that had slowly, carefully, begun to feel like something she could trust. She unfolded the letter. Ronan's handwriting, unmistakably his, precise, controlled, the hand of a man who had never once in his life allowed himself to look uncertain on paper. Astrid, I need to speak with you, not for the pack's sake, not for the bond's sake, though I understand if you no longer believe that distinction exists. I am asking for an hour of your time, and I am asking as a man who has finally understood what he destroyed. She read it twice. Then she folded it, set it on the table, and stood very still, listening to her daughter's laughter drift through the wall, and to the low, warm sound of Verk's voice answering her, and she understood with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that whatever came next was going to test every single thing she had spent the last year rebuilding. She did not go to Blackthorn immediately. She sat with the letter for 4 days, turning it over the way she turned over a difficult diagnosis, examining it from every angle before deciding how to treat it. She told Verk about it on the 5th night, after Briar had gone to sleep, sitting across from him at her small kitchen table with tea neither of them was drinking. He wants to speak with me, she said. Something's happened to him. His wolf won't answer his call anymore. His power's fading, and every alpha who used to bow to him is starting to test how far that weakness runs. Verk's face didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened, the way it did, she'd noticed, whenever he was weighing something carefully before he spoke. And you're considering going, he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an accusation either. I'm considering it because I'm a healer, and because whatever else he is still Briar's father, and if Blackthorn falls into chaos because rival packs smell weakness, that chaos doesn't stay contained to Blackthorn. It reaches every territory around it. It could reach Asheville. That's the healer talking, Verk said. What does the rest of you say? She looked at him a long moment. The rest of me says I don't owe him comfort, but I also don't get to pretend I don't understand what's happening to him, because that would be choosing not to know something just because knowing is inconvenient. I spent 9 years married to a man who did that, who managed uncomfortable truths away from the people who deserve to hear them. I'm not going to become that. Verk nodded slowly. Then go, but I want you to understand something before you do. He set down his cup. There are things about my own past you still don't know. Things I've been careful about keeping from touching your life, the same way I once tried to keep the danger in my blood from touching it 11 years ago. I've been telling myself I'd explain when the time was right. I think the time may be closer than I'd like. Something cold moved through her chest. Is this connected to Ronan, to Blackthorn? No, he said, and the certainty in his voice was immediate. This is mine alone, but it means that soon you may be standing between 2 different kinds of danger, his weakness, and whatever finally catches up to me. I need you to know that before you walk toward either one. She studied him across the table. This man who had once told her honestly that loving him would be dangerous and had been right, who had come back into her life 11 years later with a scar on his jaw and a stillness that spoke of things learned the hard way. Tell me when it's close, she said. Actually tell me, Verk, not manage it away from me the way he did. I can't build anything real with a man who thinks protecting me means keeping me blind. I will, he said. And something in the way he said it, steady, unhurried, entirely without the practiced smoothness Ronan had always spoken with, made her believe him. She traveled to Blackthorn 3 days later, alone, leaving Briar with Freya. The territory looked the same from a distance, the black pines, the gray stone walls, but something in the air had changed. She felt it the moment she crossed the border, a thinness to the pack's collective strength, the way a wound feels different from healthy flesh even before you've uncovered it. Kestrel met her at the gates himself this time, and he looked older too, the way loyal men age quickly when the thing they've sworn themselves to starts coming apart at the seams. "Thank you for coming," he said, and meant it plainly, without the stiff formality he'd worn the night she left. "I won't pretend things are good here. The younger warriors are frightened, and frightened wolves make poor decisions in a border skirmish. We need every advantage we can find, and I'm not too proud to say that includes whatever you're willing to offer, medicine or otherwise. I'm not here to offer the pack anything beyond what protects my daughter's future," Astrid said carefully. "I want that understood before I go any further into this hold." "Understood." Kestrel hesitated at the inner doors. "For what it's worth, and I know it may be worth very little to you now, he hasn't been the same man since you left. I don't say that to win your sympathy. I say it because I think you deserve to walk in there with clear eyes about what you'll find, rather than braced for the alpha who said those words in this room a year ago." She nodded once, and let him lead her the rest of the way. Ronan met her in the same war room where she had once stood outside the door holding warmed wine. He looked older than a year should have made him, thinner. There was a hollowness around his eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. "You came," he said. "I came because I'm a healer, and because I still care what happens to this territory, whatever I no longer feel for its alpha." She kept her voice level, the same voice she used delivering hard news to frightened families. "Tell me what's happening to you." Ronan was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the command it once carried. "I called my wolf at the winter moon. It didn't answer. I called again the next night and the next. Nothing. My strength has been failing since that night in this room, Astrid. Since the night you heard what I said. You know why. I've read every old text in this hold in the past month," he said. "I know why. I said the bond meant nothing, and the wolf inside me, the part of me that has always known better than my pride did, believed I meant it. It stopped answering a man who broke faith with what made him whole." He looked at her, and for the first time in 9 years she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation. "I destroyed it myself, with my own mouth." She said nothing for a long moment, letting the fire crackle between them. "What do you want from me, Ronan?" "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect the bond restored. I understand that isn't how this works, that a broken faith doesn't simply mend because the one who broke it finally regrets it. I asked you here because Ironclaw is testing the border and Riverbend has stopped answering summons. And if Blackthorn falls to a challenge while I can't shift, the chaos won't stop at these walls. Briar's mother deserves to know what's coming so she can protect their daughter from it." For the first time since she'd arrived, Astrid felt something soften slightly. Not forgiveness. Nothing close to it, but a grim, professional recognition of a danger that was, as he said, no longer only his. "Then let's talk about protecting Briar," she said. "Nothing else, not us, just that." Ronan nodded, and for a moment in the firelight of the room where everything had ended, something like an old, exhausted honesty passed between them. Not love, not anymore, but the shape of two people who had once built something real, however badly it had finally broken. Before she rode out through the gates, Kestrel caught her once more, holding something small wrapped in cloth. "He asked me to give you this if you were willing to take it. Said he wouldn't press it on you himself, that you'd earned the right not to be asked for anything more tonight." Inside the cloth was a small pressed flower, long dried, the same kind that grew wild along the ridge where they'd once walked together as a young, unbroken bond. She recognized it instantly. She had tucked one just like it into a book the first winter of her mating, and had left it behind, along with everything else, the night she walked out. She did not know what to do with the feeling that rose in her at the sight of it. Not longing exactly. Something more like grief for a version of herself who had once believed a pressed flower meant forever. She wrapped it back in the cloth and tucked it into her saddlebag, not because she intended to keep it as a keepsake, but because throwing it away felt like a cruelty she didn't need to commit, and keeping it felt, oddly, like closing a door properly instead of simply walking away from it unlatched. She rode home through the dark pines, turning it over in her mind, the flower and the growl and the hollow, honest look on Ronan's face, and by the time Asheville's lights came into view, she had made her peace with one clear truth. She could witness a man's reckoning without owing him her heart in exchange for it. Those were different debts entirely, and she intended to keep them separate for as long as she lived. She left Blackthorn that night with a promise to return if the border truly failed, and a heavier weight in her chest than she'd expected to carry home, because she understood now that Ronan's unraveling was not going to stay contained, and that whatever came next would test her long before she was ready. She returned to Asheville 2 days later to find Verk waiting at her door, and something in his face told her, before he spoke a single word, that his own reckoning had finally caught up with him. "It's here," he said simply, "the thing I told you about." She let him in, sent word to Freya to keep Briar another night, and sat across from him at the same table where he'd first warned her something was coming. 11 years ago," he said, "I told you I was hunted by my own blood. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and I think you've earned the whole truth now, whatever it costs me to give it." She waited, hands folded, the healer's stillness she used when a patient needed room to speak before she moved to help. "My birth name isn't Ashwood," he said. "It's Verkim Burholt. My father was the last true alpha of the old royal line, the Emberwolf bloodline, the one the ancient packs used to answer to before the territories split into 100 smaller kingdoms fighting each other for scraps of the old power. When he was killed by his own beta in a bid for the throne, I was 7 years old. My mother fled with me into the northern wilds and raised me under a false name, because the bloodline carries a mark, a strength no ordinary wolf holds, and every ambitious alpha in the old territories would have killed to claim it, or killed to make certain it never grew strong enough to challenge them." Astrid sat very still. "That's why you left, 11 years ago." "That's why I told you to run," he said. "Because the men hunting my blood don't care who stands beside me. They see it as leverage or as collateral, and I have spent my whole life making certain no one I love becomes either." He looked at her, something raw moving behind his eyes. "The Northern Territories I've spent 5 years in, I wasn't only working. I was building something, alliances, a path back toward reclaiming what was taken from my father, not for a throne, Astrid, I don't want a throne. But because as long as the old bloodline stays hidden and hunted, ambitious wolves like the ones now circling Blackthorn will keep tearing weaker packs apart to fill the power vacuum the old royal line left behind. I came back south to finish what I started, and the men who killed my father have finally traced me here." The fire popped softly in the silence that followed. "Tell me about him," Astrid said quietly. "Your father. You've never once spoken his name to me in 14 years. Verk was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rougher, older, like the words had been kept sealed away so long they'd grown unfamiliar even to him. "His name was Casimir. I remember very little of him directly. I was 7, and children remember feelings more clearly than facts. I remember that he used to let me sit on the great chair during council sessions. I was far too young to understand, and that he never once told me to be quiet, even when my questions interrupted men twice my age. I remember my mother screamed the night his own beta turned on him at a peace gathering that was never meant to be peaceful at all. I remember running, and I remember not stopping for 3 days. Verke. My mother spent the rest of her life making certain I understood one thing clearly," he went on before she could reach for him. "That the bloodline itself was not a gift. It was a debt other men would always try to collect from me, one way or another, through fear, through use, through simple cruelty, because a mark that old and that rare makes ordinary wolves either want to kneel to it or destroy it, and precious few of them ever want anything gentler in between. She taught me to hide it. I've spent 24 years hiding it, and some tired, worn-down part of me is glad tonight to finally be done. The fire popped softly in the silence that followed. "Are you in danger?" she asked, "here now in Asheville?" "Possibly, for a short while." The same certainty Ronan once carried, and yet entirely different in how it landed, because Verk was not managing the truth away from her. He was placing the whole of it in her hands and trusting her to hold it. "I would never let it reach you or Briar. I've spent 11 years being careful about exactly that." "You don't control everything, Verk." "No," he agreed. "But I am careful about this particular thing, more careful than I have ever been about anything else in my life." She sat with that a long moment, turning over the shape of the choice in front of her. Because it was a choice, she understood now, not a thing that simply happened to her the way Ronan's betrayal had. Loving Verk meant accepting a danger with no fixed end date, a shadow that might never fully lift, a life built partly on uncertainty rather than the false, brittle safety she'd once mistaken for love. She thought of Briar, asleep down the road at Freya's, and wondered whether it was fair to invite that uncertainty anywhere near her daughter's life a second time. "I need to ask you something difficult," she said, "and I need an honest answer, not a comforting one." "Always." "If loving me puts Briar in danger, real danger, not the abstract kind, will you tell me plainly, even if it means I ask you to stay away from us until it's resolved? Even if that costs you everything you might want for yourself?" Verk didn't answer immediately, and she respected him more for the hesitation than she would have for a quick reassurance. "Yes," he finally said. "I would tell you, and I would step back if that was what safety required, however much it cost me. I have already lost 11 years to protecting you from a distance. I would rather lose 11 more than let my presence be the reason harm ever reaches her." It was not a comfortable answer. It was, she thought, exactly the honest one she'd asked for, and she found she trusted it far more than she would have trusted an easy promise that nothing would ever go wrong. She thought of the old law the elders spoke of, that a wolf's strength was tied to the honesty of its bonds, and wondered distantly whether that was why Verk's wolf had always answered him so completely, so unlike Ronan's. He had never lied to her, not once, not even when the truth cost him everything. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Not that nothing dangerous will ever come near us. I've stitched too many wounds to believe any promise like that. I need you to promise you'll tell me when it's close. Actually tell me, not manage it away because you've decided I can't carry it." "I promise," he said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the first time she had touched him with intention since he'd walked back into her life. "Then keep building whatever you're building, and when it's close to done, you tell me, and we decide together what happens next, not you deciding alone what I'm allowed to know." Something shifted in his face, relief, and something warmer beneath it, something that looked almost like the 11 years ago version of him, the one who had looked at her like he was memorizing her laugh. "You're the only person who's ever asked to carry this with me instead of asking me to carry it alone," he said quietly. "Then I suppose it's time somebody did." Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always did, but for the first time in a long while, Astrid did not feel like a woman bracing against a storm alone. She felt, instead, like a woman standing beside someone who had finally chosen honesty over protection-shaped silence. And she understood that this, more than any bond mark the moon had ever pressed into her skin, was what trust was actually built from. Word came at midwinter that Ironclaw had crossed the Blackthorn border. It wasn't a full challenge, not yet, but a testing raid, the kind ambitious alphas sent out to measure how weak a rival truly was before committing to open war. Ronan's remaining warriors held the line, but barely, and the courier who brought the news to Asheville looked shaken in a way that told Astrid the truth before he'd finished his report. "The Alpha still can't shift," the courier said. "He fought the raid in human form, on foot, beside his own beta. He held, but only just. Ironclaw's Alpha is telling every territory that Blackthorn's throne is undefended in all but name. Freya arrived at the infirmary within the hour, tense and packing. "This is bigger than Ronan now," she said. "If Ironclaw takes Blackthorn, they won't stop at the border. Asheville is small, Astrid. We have no standing army, no Alpha strong enough to hold a real challenge. If Blackthorn falls, we're next on anyone's list." Astrid felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest. Not for Ronan, not anymore, but for every family in Asheville who had nothing to do with a broken bond and a proud man's cruel words, and who would suffer the consequences regardless. That evening, she found Verk at the river clearing and told him everything. "The council law is old but clear," she said. "An Alpha's strength returns only if the broken faith is somehow answered, not necessarily restored. The elders say, but acknowledged, witnessed, made right in the eyes of the pack and the moon both. Ronan can't simply apologize in private and expect his wolf to forgive him. It has to be spoken where it was broken, and witnessed the same way the breaking was." "You think there's a way to save him?" Verk said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation either, though she heard the careful control in his voice holding something back. "I think there's a way to save Asheville," she said, "and every small pack between here and Blackthorn that will be swallowed if Ironclaw wins. I don't love him anymore, Verk. That ended the night I heard him call our bond nothing. But I'm not going to let an entire territory burn because I'd rather not stand in a room with him one more time." Verk was quiet a long moment, watching the river move black and silver under the moon. "There's something I haven't told you," he finally said. "The alliances I've built in the north, some of those wolves owe the Emberwolf bloodline old debts, older than Ironclaw's ambition. If I reveal who I truly am publicly at a council fire, it would carry weight. It might be enough to make Ironclaw reconsider testing weakness at all, bloodline or no bloodline restored to a throne." "That's a risk to you," Astrid said. "The men hunting you would know exactly where to find you." "They already know I'm close," he said. "I've felt them circling for weeks. The only question is whether I face them on my own terms in the open with allies around me, or wait until they find me some quiet night when I'm least prepared for it." She reached for his hand without thinking, the way she had at her kitchen table weeks before. "If you do this, you do it because it's right, not because you think it will win you something with me. I need that to be true." "It's right," he said simply. "That's enough of a reason on its own, whatever else it does or doesn't win me." The night before they left, Freya found Astrid packing medicines by lamplight and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Wearing the particular expression she reserved for moments she considered her sisterly duty to be difficult. "You understand what you're asking Verk to do," Freya said. "Stand in front of half the northern territories and announce himself as bait for every ambitious wolf who spent 2 decades hunting his bloodline. That's not a small thing to ask of a man, Astrid, whatever debt he thinks he owes the world for surviving his father." "I'm not asking him to do anything," Astrid said. "He offered. Because he loves you, and loving you apparently means throwing himself in front of whatever storm is coming for the people you care about. I'd think you, of all people, would recognize how dangerous that pattern can become if it isn't checked." Astrid set down the jar she was holding and looked at her sister fully. "There's a difference, Freya, and I need you to see it, because I had to learn to see it myself. Ronan hid things from me because he decided, on his own, that I wasn't strong enough or important enough to carry them. Verk is choosing to stand in the open in front of me and let me help him carry something instead of hiding it away to protect me from a truth I have every right to. One of those is control dressed up as love. The other is trust. I spent 9 years mistaking the first for the second. I don't intend to make that mistake twice." Freya was quiet a moment, some of the fight going out of her. "You've changed," she finally said. "Since Blackthorn, I don't think I've told you that." "I had to," Astrid said simply. "It was that or stay broken, and I had a daughter who needed better than broken." Freya crossed the room and hugged her, quick and fierce the way she'd hugged her since they were girls. Then I'll ride with you tomorrow. Somebody sensible needs to be there in case you two decide honesty is worth more than caution. They rode for Blackthorn 3 days later. Astrid, Verk, Freya, and a dozen Asheville wolves who had volunteered once word spread of what was at stake. Before the fire was lit, Verk found a quiet moment with her outside the great hall, the two of them standing in the same courtyard where she had once been taught to read storm clouds by a man who no longer existed in any form she recognized. "If this goes badly," Verk said, "I need you to take Briar and Freya and ride for Asheville immediately. Don't wait for me. Don't look back to see how it's unfolding. I need to know, whatever else happens tonight, that you're clear of it." "I told you once already," Astrid said. "I'm not standing outside another closed door, Verk, not even to protect myself." "This isn't a closed door. This is a battlefield, and battlefields are different." His voice was steady, but something beneath it wasn't. "I have spent my whole life being careful about exactly this moment, and now that it's finally here, the only thing I can't be careful about is you. So let me have this one condition. Let me know you're safe, whatever else I have to walk into tonight." She studied his face a long moment, and understood, finally, that this wasn't the old pattern repeating. This wasn't a man deciding on his own what she was allowed to know or where she was allowed to stand. This was a man asking, plainly, for the one thing that would let him walk into danger with a clear head, and trusting her enough to simply ask for it rather than arrange it behind her back. "If it turns," she said, "I'll take them and go. I promise you that, but you come back to us after, that's my condition." "I intend to," he said, and kissed her once, quick and fierce, before they walked back toward the hall together. Ronan received them in the same great hall where the council once gathered to hear him name Astrid's mating strategic, and the irony of it was not lost on her as she walked through those doors again, this time not as his mate, but as a healer and a witness both. Ronan looked thinner still than he had weeks before, but he stood with what dignity remained to him as the hall filled, his own council, envoys from 3 neighboring territories drawn by rumor and curiosity, and Ironclaw's own scouts watching from the shadowed edges, exactly as Astrid had guessed they would. "I called this gathering," Ronan said, his voice carrying despite its new, unfamiliar strain, "to speak a truth in the same room where I once spoke a lie. 9 years ago I mated Astrid Kine and told my council, told myself, that the bond meant nothing beyond strategy. That was false. I have known it was false for a long time and was too proud to say so before it cost me everything a proud man fears losing." The hall had gone utterly silent. Astrid felt every eye shift toward her, and she kept her spine straight, her face the same careful stillness she wore delivering hard truths in the infirmary. "I am not asking for the bond restored," Ronan went on. "I understand that faith broken cannot simply be spoken back into existence, but I owe this pack, and I owe her, the truth spoken as plainly and as publicly as the lie was." The fire in the great hearth cracked and shifted, and for one long moment nothing happened at all. Then, low and rolling like distant thunder finally arriving, a sound moved through Ronan's chest that the whole hall could hear, a growl deep and ragged, the sound of something long silent finally, tentatively, answering. The growl did not mean forgiveness. Astrid understood that immediately, even as gasps rippled through the gathered hall. It meant only that Ronan's wolf had heard something honest for the first time in 9 years, not restoration, only the smallest, most fragile beginning of one, a crack of strength returning to a foundation that would need far longer than one truthful speech to rebuild. It was, she realized with grim satisfaction, exactly enough. Ironclaw's scouts, watching from the shadows, exchanged uneasy glances. A wolf whose strength was returning, however slowly, was no longer the easy, undefended target their alpha had promised them. That was when Verk stepped forward. "There is another truth owed to this hall tonight," he said, and his voice carried a different weight than Ronan's, not the strained voice of a man rebuilding something broken, but the steady voice of a man finally setting down a burden he'd carried since childhood. My name is not Ashwood. I am Verk Imberhold, last living blood of the Imberwolf line, son of the Alpha murdered by his own beta 24 years ago in a bid for a throne that was never rightfully his to take. The silence that followed was different from the first, heavier, charged with old history that most of the wolves in that hall had only heard as legend. I do not stand here to claim any throne, Verk continued. I have spent 5 years building alliances across the northern territories, not to seize power, but to make certain no ambitious alpha could carve up weaker packs the way mine was carved up when I was 7 years old. Ironclaw's alpha is welcome to test Blackthorn's borders. He should understand first exactly what standing behind that border now costs him. One of the shadowed figures near the hall's edge shifted, and Astrid recognized, with a cold jolt, the look of a wolf recalculating every plan he'd walked in with. You claim a great deal on very little proof, the Ironclaw scout finally said, stepping half into the firelight, his voice pitched to carry a challenge the whole hall would hear. Old bloodlines make convenient stories for wolves looking to buy themselves protection they haven't earned. Then test it, Verk said, without raising his voice at all, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. Send word to your alpha that the Imberholt line still breathes, and let him decide for himself whether he wants to be the one who finally learns what that costs a rival, or whether he'd rather withdraw from a border he was never going to hold anyway once winter turned to spring. The scout's jaw tightened. Beside him, one of the northern envoys Verk had named allies stepped forward and spoke, quiet but clear enough for the whole hall to hear. I have sworn an old debt to that bloodline, and I renew it here tonight before every witness in this hall. Ironclaw would do well to remember that debts among the northern packs run deeper than any single season's ambition. Astrid watched the scout's composure crack, just slightly, at the edges. The look of a man who had arrived expecting an easy victory and was leaving instead with a far more complicated calculation to carry home. The Ironclaw scout left before the fire had burned another hour lower, and word came within days that their alpha had withdrawn his raiding parties from Blackthorn's border entirely. Not out of mercy, but out of the plain, practical fear of provoking a fight against both a slowly recovering alpha and the last heir of a bloodline half the northern territory still owed old debts to. Freya found her later that night in the courtyard, watching Verk speak quietly with the northern envoys near the gates, his posture easier than she had seen it in months, as though setting the truth down publicly had lightened something in him that even years of distance had never managed to touch. I take it back, Freya said, coming to stand beside her. What I said before we left about the danger, I still think it was a frightening thing to ask of him, but I watched that hall tonight, and I don't think I've ever seen a man look more like himself than the moment he stopped hiding. No, Astrid agreed quietly, neither have I. And Ronan? Astrid considered the question honestly before answering. I think he'll survive this. I think his strength may even mostly return if he keeps choosing the harder truth over the easier lie the way he did tonight. But I don't think he'll ever again command a room without earning it first. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing for him to learn, this late in his life. Freya slipped an arm through hers, and the two of them stood together in the cold courtyard a while longer, watching the fire's glow still flickering through the great hall's windows, watching a broken kingdom begin, slowly and imperfectly, to mend itself around the honesty it had so badly lacked. Astrid stood near the back of the hall through all of it, watching two men she had loved at different points in her life stand in the same firelight and choose, each in his own way, to finally stop hiding from what they carried. It struck her, watching them, how differently the same instinct could unfold in two different hearts, Ronan's honesty arriving a year too late, wrung out of him only once his power had already begun to fail, Verk's arriving freely, offered before anything forced his hand, because he had decided somewhere along the way that she was worth more than the safety of his old silence. She did not judge Ronan for the difference. She understood better than most how slowly some truths came to men who had spent their whole lives being told that strength meant never admitting weakness. But she also understood, watching Verk stand unflinching in that firelight with his whole hidden history laid bare before rivals who might yet come to kill him for it, which kind of honesty she wanted built into the rest of her life. Blackthorn held, Asheville and every small pack behind it held with it. But holding a territory and healing a bond were not the same work, and Astrid understood that better than anyone in that hall. In the days that followed, as the immediate danger cooled into cautious relief, she found herself standing once more in the war room where everything had first ended, this time with Ronan alone. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for speaking the truth about Briar's protection instead of letting Asheville burn out of spite. I would have understood." "I didn't do it for you," she said honestly. "I want you to understand that clearly, so there's no confusion between us going forward. I did it for every family in 3 territories who had nothing to do with what you said to me in this room." "I understand that." He was quiet a moment. "I loved you." Astrid, somewhere in 9 years of managing borders and bloodlines and council politics, I convinced myself loving you was a weakness I couldn't afford to admit, even to myself, and I let that fear speak a lie so total it nearly cost me everything, including the daughter we share. I don't expect you to forgive that. I only wanted you to hear it plainly, once, the way I should have said it from the beginning. She studied him a long moment, this man who had once been her whole world, now smaller in her chest than she'd ever imagined he could become, not because she hated him, but because she had finally, fully let him go. "I forgive the man," she said quietly. "I don't return to what we were. Those are different things, Ronan, and I need you to understand the difference the way you're only now understanding the difference between strategy and truth." He nodded slowly. "Briar will always have a father who loves her honestly, whatever else I've failed at." "That's enough," Astrid said. "That's genuinely enough." She left Blackthorn that evening for the last time as anything other than a visiting healer, and she rode home through the dark pines toward Asheville, toward her daughter, toward a small drafty cottage with a hearth that smoked when the wind came from the north, and toward a man waiting for her there who had chosen, every single time it mattered, to hand her the whole truth instead of managing it away. Spring came to Asheville the slow, reluctant way it always did at the edge of wolf country, and then, almost overnight, it arrived in full, the bakery 2 streets over opening its shutters earlier each morning, the smell of fresh bread drifting through Astrid's window at first light, which Briar still considered a personal gift from the universe, even at 9 years old and newly, fiercely devoted to her herb studies. The threat from the north that had once hunted Verk's bloodline had not vanished entirely. Old debts and old dangers rarely did, he told her honestly, and she had long since stopped expecting easy endings from a world that didn't deal in them. But the alliances he'd spent 5 years building had held strong through the confrontation at Blackthorn, and the men who once hunted him quietly from the shadows now had far more reason to negotiate than to strike. The weeks after Blackthorn had not been simple. Word of Verk's true bloodline spread quickly through the northern territories, and with it came both the old debts he'd spoken of and a handful of new dangers he hadn't fully anticipated. Wolves who saw an unclaimed throne rather than a man who wanted no part of one. Envoys who arrived at Asheville's border with careful, probing questions Astrid did not entirely trust. Twice that spring, Verk disappeared for several days at a time to meet with allies in the north, and both times he told her plainly where he was going and why before he left, and both times he returned exactly when he said he would. It was not the easy, uncomplicated love the old songs described. It asked something of her that Ronan's careful, controlled devotion never had, a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to trust a process rather than a promise of permanent safety, to build a life in full knowledge that some of its dangers would never be entirely resolved. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she preferred it this way. An uncertain truth, she had come to believe, was worth infinitely more than a comfortable lie. "It isn't finished," he told her one evening in early spring, sitting on the low stone wall behind her cottage while Briar chased fireflies in the last of the daylight. I want you to know that clearly. There may be more difficult seasons ahead. I know, Astrid said. You told me, the way you promised you would. That's the part that matters to me, not whether the danger is finished, but whether you keep choosing to tell me the truth of it instead of managing it away because you've decided I can't carry it. I learned that lesson a long time ago, he said. The hard way. I don't intend to unlearn it. She thought of the woman who had once stood outside a war room door holding warmed wine, listening to her own bond described as strategy and nothing more. She thought of the small, drafty cottage she'd built into something warm and hers, plank by plank, herb by herb. She thought of Briar, announcing to anyone who'd listen that she intended to be the finest healer 3 territories had ever seen. She thought of what it felt like to be looked at by a man who had spent 11 years remembering the shape of her laugh, and who had never once, not even when the truth cost him everything, chosen a comfortable lie over an honest one. Ask me something, she said. He looked at her, something careful and hopeful moving behind his eyes. Whatever this is between us, he said slowly, whatever it costs, the danger that isn't finished, the bloodline I still carry, the alliances I still have to hold together, is it worth it to you? Truly. She thought of the old law the elders spoke of, the one that said a wolf's strength was tied not to power or bloodline or throne, but to the honesty of its bonds. She thought of Ronan, slowly, painfully rebuilding a strength he'd nearly destroyed with 9 years of comfortable lies. She thought of Verk, whose wolf, she suspected without ever needing to ask, had never once wavered because he had never once lied to the moon or to her. Yes, she said, but on my terms. Name them. I keep the infirmary. I keep healing whatever comes. That isn't negotiable, not for you, not for anyone. Obviously. Briar comes first, always. No exceptions, no matter what alliances or dangers or old bloodlines come calling. I would expect nothing less. And I need you to keep telling me when things are hard, she said, quieter now. Not managing it away because you've decided protecting me means keeping me blind. I have stitched wolves closed while they bled out under my hands. I can carry difficult truths. What I can't carry is another decade of finding them out standing outside a closed door. I know you can carry it, Verk said. That was never truly the fear. Then what was? He was quiet a long moment, the fireflies drifting gold and slow in the darkening yard, Briar's laughter carrying faint and bright across the grass. That if you knew the full weight of what I still carry, you might decide it wasn't worth staying for, before I'd finished carrying it far enough away from you to matter. Are you finished? Almost. Then keep going, she said, reaching for his hand the way she had at her kitchen table months before, steady now instead of uncertain. And tell me when it's done. We'll carry the rest of it together, the way it should have always been carried by both of us honestly or not at all. The bakery below began its earliest deliveries before dawn the next morning, the way it always did, and Astrid stood at her small kitchen window watching the town wake. Briar still asleep down the hall, Verk steady breathing behind her in the quiet cottage that had slowly, patiently become something neither borrowed nor strategic, but entirely, deliberately chosen. She thought, standing at that window, of every version of herself that had led to this one, the girl on the riverbank who had loved a stranger with no name, the young mate who had believed in permanence, the woman who had stood outside a war room door and felt something in her go terribly, clarifyingly still. She did not regret any of them, not even the ones who had made mistakes she could see clearly now in hindsight. Each of them had carried her, one careful step at a time, toward a morning like this one, ordinary, warm, entirely hers. It was not the life she had once planned for herself, back when she was young enough to believe the moon's bond mark was the only kind of certainty worth trusting. It was messier than that, and harder, full of old dangers not yet fully resolved, and a man who came with a history he couldn't simply set down. A history she was choosing to stand beside, not behind, not blind too, but seeing clearly and staying anyway. A week later, Briar found the small wooden otter still sitting on her shelf, and beside it, a second carving Verk had left the night before, a little wolf, still rough at the edges but recognizably, unmistakably better than the first attempt. "It's less terrible," Briar announced at breakfast, holding it up for formal inspection. "High praise," Verk said, and Astrid laughed so suddenly and so freely that Briar looked between the two of them with the deep, assessing suspicion of a child who has just realized something important is happening that the adults haven't bothered explaining to her yet. "Are you going to be here a lot now?" Briar asked him directly, the way only a 9-year-old could ask a question that large without flinching from it. Verk glanced at Astrid first, not for permission exactly, but for confirmation, the way he'd learned, slowly and deliberately, to include her in every decision that touched their small shared life, rather than deciding things quietly on his own. "If your mother will have me," he said, "yes, I'd like that very much." Briar considered this with the same gravity she gave every important verdict. "You have to keep practicing the carvings," she said finally. "And you have to let me teach you the herb names properly, because you still mix up the fever root and the sleep root, and that's dangerous." "I accept those terms," Verk said solemnly, and held out his hand to shake hers, which Briar took with enormous satisfaction, as though a formal treaty had just been signed. Far to the north, in the great hall at Blackthorn, Ronan Draven called his wolf again at the spring moon, and for the first time in over a year, it answered not fully, not with the old total strength he'd once commanded, but enough. Enough to remind every alpha who'd stopped bowing that strength rebuilt on truth, however slowly, was still strength worth respecting. And in a small cottage at the edge of Asheville territory, under a sky just beginning to lighten toward morning, Astrid Kine understood at last that she had not simply survived what Ronan Draven's cruelty had broken in her. She had built something entirely new from what was left imperfect, still carrying old scars, still facing seasons not yet finished. But true, chosen hers. More than enough. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments what you think happened after the ending. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you soon.